Welcome to Pop-Up Presentations 2024 edition. We are going to start this season off with a retrospective on a game that I thought should have gotten a better chance, although it was out of everybody's control, and um, really kind of looking at what does it mean to pay attention to like how a game's going to evolve throughout the season, what things make a game good or bad or effective, and what things you should be focusing on. Infinite Recharge was super cool. It was a great game. We shouldn't have lost it. We should have lost a different game. We're back. When I say we, it's mostly just going to be me. Hi, everybody. I know we didn't have an opening, like a uh, like a post that told you that we were going to do this. It's a pop-up presentation, right? Planning is not one of our strong suits. It's mostly me. I'm Steve. I've been doing FRC since 2006, well, fall of 2005, mentoring since the 2008 season, and I joined Jack in the Bot for the 2023 season when I moved up here to work for Swerve Drive Specialties as a CNC operator. This season, 2020, was the second year that we were doing First TV's play-by-play. So we would go up to the First TV studios in Manchester and we'd watch all the matches and we'd sort of do the in-between match things as Robo Sports Network. Kind of the same thing that we do at Champs. And it's the many matches from different fields or different events like championships, and less like how we do Chessy and other events like that where we're just there in between every match. But week one of 2020, I got to do that. So I got to see a lot of how the game played the first time that anybody tried to play it. And then week two, I was a head ref at the Southeastern Massachusetts district event. So I got to see it from field side. A couple of teams that had played more than once or had played in week one and then were playing in week two, and then a bunch of teams for whom it was their first event. So I got to see a lot of this game before. Well, I mean, we knew the second week that it was going to get pretty bad, but we didn't know that it was going to get shut down like super hard. So they were praising everybody for washing their hands a lot and having to restock the soap in the high school gymnasium bathrooms, which was a good thing. We were trying. We didn't really know what to do. But then, like the Thursday after that, it was, oh, the season's over. So I think there were teams loading in at events when they were told that it was going to stop. And I mean, that's bad, but it was also, I imagine it was incredibly difficult to get everything from an organizational standpoint set up so that, oh yeah, no, we're actually canceling the season. We're going to be eating like a bunch of contracts or question mark. Like we're going into actual lockdown. So making that call was probably not something that you could just, oh well, yeah, let me just email every single team and tell them, oh, it's over. So 2020 was weird, and then I saw the game played in 2021 off season. So the Infinite Recharge at home, they'd changed a couple of things, but I saw it at the Texas Cup that year and at Chessy Champs. So I got to see a lot of this game, especially compared to the availability, like other people's potential to even see it. So I have a soft spot for it. But it's not just about Infinite Recharge. I have preferences for what games I like and what aspects of games I like. So within the FRC games, I don't have a list. I don't have these are my favorite 5 in ranked order, and these are my least favorite. I don't have that. I have games that I like a lot. I have games that I don't like. I have elements of games that I think kind of ruined them, and vice versa. Elements of games that were so good, but the rest of the game didn't really catch up to it. But what I want rewarded for what I want teams to be rewarded for by the game is something similar to basketball, well, NBA specifically. The way that it works in the NBA is mostly the top 2 seeds out of each conference make the finals and win. Like the teams that are good are evidently good throughout the regular season, and then they continue to be good in the playoffs. And rarely does it turn into just this sort of RNG chaos fest. Once you're in the playoffs, anything can happen. Um, you're generally what you what you say you are on the tin. Injuries, I mean, that we getting deep into the specifics of it, but uh, there are a lot of possessions in an NBA game, like 100 per team. So like the talent and the scheme will out, and then the series are 7 game series, and all the rounds, all 4 rounds that a team has to play in the playoffs to win. So in certain matchups, it can be dictated by like a strength of one team actually negates everything that a theoretically better team has, like based on regular season performance. But it's rare that that does do in an entire series for teams that have wild disparities in their overall quality. It can change matchups and it can change single games, but the better team wins. So I want FRC games where the better alliance wins. And yes, that's a subjective thing, but it should like yes, most events I kind of want the 1 seed to win. Like you should be proving during the qualification matches why you're the best. Then you pick the team that works with you the best, and you get another team that you're both happy with on the Serpentine. And then you're really good. And that was what the qualifications proved. And you're still really good in the playoffs because it's the same game, or should at least be quite similar. And so when there are a bunch of what look like um, random outcomes from games, it's not my favorite thing. Um, and I also like games where the losing team scores a lot, where it doesn't, or at least it is you're not doubling up the other alliance. There should be a lot of points that each alliance can gain that the other alliance doesn't have a lot of influence over, and then it just turns into these inflection points. But it's not just we can shut down the game for them. Like we win these matches because they don't get to play, and we get to play. I think that these sort of snowball effects, they're only good in certain games that, like my favorite game, 2018. But that one, like there's a constant struggle for it. You're not just locked out immediately, and you have the opportunity to do something about it. And again, with my list of games, like I volunteer a lot of weeks throughout the season, and then I'm with my team for others. So there are some games that are great from a team perspective. There are some games that are great. Like when you finally get to the competition, it's so much fun to play it. And there are games when it's really fun to build for and just solve the technical parts of the game, and then solve the technical parts of the challenge, and then the game doesn't really live up to it. And then there there are other FRC games where it's pretty chill to be out on the field, and it makes sense what you're doing during the match to make the match work as like a field resetter or a referee or whatever. And there are other games where it's a chore, where it's actually very difficult, and it makes for a worse experience for everybody. Maybe the best game for referees was 2012. Very clear foul zones and think. I mean, they had all the hand signals that year. You had to like hold up 3 fingers for holding more than 3 basketballs, and like pat your head or offsides. They got rid of all the signals. There's like 1.5 signals, 3 signals that referees have to do now for foul, tech foul, and pitting. But like this, it was very hard to remember. Oh, they did a G whatever violation. That's this hand signal. So that didn't stay. But aside from that, like the way that the game played out, teams didn't actually have that many violations, which is good. You don't want transactional fouls, or I don't. It doesn't make sense to me. Like it shouldn't be the only way to play this game is to get a certain number of fouls for the flow of the match to work. These are some of my thoughts on what makes a good FRC game. So what was Infinite Recharge? I think it was a great FRC game. So the field, which I'll show you in a second, and you may be able to pull it up on your own. The field had a big structure in the middle with an allegedly open, piece of field. So kind of like the stage truss, it had truss legs going up and it went to whatever, and you didn't care about that. If you were just going through it, instead of a flat floor, there were a bunch of little 1 inch tall steel beams. It was the berms from uh, 2016 that were like the stronghold, like the part of the field that you could go over that wasn't the defenses, and they were the things that corralled the cargo in 2019. And they chewed up wheels like crazy. And they didn't notice in 2016 because everybody was running around in pneumatic tires or tank treads, which had their own issues. But oh, this is a great like field element to put out there. Like it can hold things, it can corral things. We can put holes in it, and then like game objects will be able to sit in there and not move. But 2020 version of Infinite Recharge showed that you couldn't have omni wheels in your robot. The little sideways spinning wheels would just shrapnel as soon as you drove over them. I think the team I was on, 190, they played 2 weeks that year. They played week 1 and week 2. They went through like 8 omni wheels. It was skid or traction wheel, omni wheel, 6-wheel drive, but they'd go through and just it was not a forgiving field in that way. So the center of the field had this sort of caltrops situation, and you also had like a very smooth, just bare carpet, and then like a clotheslining table over your trench run. So you could go through that as long as you were low enough. And teams have learned every year that there's a thing that you can go over that you can go under, like the low bar. You can have something that pops up above the low bar. You just have to do it occasionally, and then in the match that matters, you tear off your entire like turreted shooter. But what was really interesting, so there are elements of crescendo in Infinite Recharge. So you'd pick up from the human player station, and you'd drive across the field, and you could stop. Well, you couldn't shoot full field, so there was a little sort of wing equivalent area that was your alliance zone, that was next to your your loading area, not your scoring area. But for about a quarter of the field, you couldn't shoot, so you had to get up to about where the trench run started, and you could shoot long range shots from there. Or you could go to the end of your trench run, which was still a protected zone, and you could shoot from there. And opponents couldn't hit you, but they could maybe block your shot if your output was low and they had like a big piece of cardboard or whatever. You could go to the line that you started in auto, which was that was the line that you can't shoot from behind your alliance zone line. Just on the opposite end of the field, it's their alliance zone line. So you could shoot from there. So you could have like a good set of shots from this line, because you're going to be shooting from there in auto if you want to shoot before you move. That's where your robot starts. Or you could go all the way up to the protected little triangle that lived right under the outer port and the inner port, like the high goal that you scored in. You could go there and you could shoot like these angled shots that would hit off the top of it, kind of like a subwoofer shot, but actually protected zone instead of just a thing that you could be next to. So you had different endpoints that you could go to. Your alliance could shoot from different places, and your match flow could look very different, one match to the next, depending on where people like to pick up game pieces from and shoot from. The autonomous mode, there were so many. The game pieces were called power cells. There were so many power cells that you could end up picking up. It was like 5, 10, there were about 20 on the field at large. So you couldn't pass certain lines on the field, but you could get to a lot of your opponent's ones. You could, in fact, get to all of them. Some of them were in a protected zone. So if they were there, you couldn't be there. But 20 extra power cells available for pickup in auto. You could have very different autonomous scores. But you weren't all going for the same ones. Like if you were racing for a set of power cells, you'd probably get there before your opponents. It was a rotationally symmetrical field, so there weren't places where it would be equidistant. Like if you started in the same relative place to your scoring, your port, your outer and inner port, and you went for the same power cell as somebody else, one of you would be driving a different distance. So it wasn't just racing. which positives and negatives to that, but I think we've seen it a couple of times, and it seems like it's mostly a negative thing. These like all-out races to the center of something. 2015, the can races were bad, and there were interesting things this year, but it's kind of like crescendo. There weren't enough notes. You kind of ended up with uh, it coming down to misses. Like you wanted to pick them up and get them over to your side, but yeah, the auto scores weren't there weren't big differences between autonomous scores once you got up to reasonably competitive levels. Um, it was a high capacity game in that you could hold 5 power cells during the course of the match. It's like with 2022 Rapid React, that's not high capacity. You do have to pick up more than one thing if you want to have efficient cycles. You do have to get 2 of them, but you aren't able to go over to a field of them and come back with a litter and then go do something fun with it. You had to get into these kind of shorter cycles, and that's been true of the last 2 games definitely. Any game where you can only pick up one game object, you have to find efficiencies and cycles and all of these things. There are always efficiencies and cycles, but at least with Infinite Recharge with high capacity games, you can have a couple of inefficiencies there if you make them up in other areas, because if you're able to get all 5 of your power cells into the outer port a quarter of a second after you start trying to do that, that's a great competitive advantage regardless of how long it takes you to pick up those 5 in the first place, how long it takes you to drive over. So you can get to these really high leverage moments even if your whole match flow isn't perfectly optimized. The end game, there were whatever it was, this coat hanger that could swing. It was a challenge that talked about you wanted that structure to be level with all the robots on it, and it was a bar that you could grab onto and pull up. But overall, it looked like you really cared about where each robot was exactly placed, but robots all kind of weigh the same amount and they take up a certain amount of space on it. So it worked out that if you could put a thing up there and pull down, you were probably fine. Like that was very good for you to have it, and you didn't need like a magic one, like a super special like tracking along, like driving along the thing to balance, or a set of counterweights or anything. You could kind of just have a hook, put it up there, and pull down, and you would be able to get the highest score possible in the end game with like a coordinated alliance. Um, the places where you could be defended, kind of not at your pickup place, but near it, in between there and the undefendable like trench run area, and then your other defended shooting from area. There were big pockets of space in between those, so there were places for the opponent to actually defend you, and those also weren't right next to truss legs or other big field elements. So it wasn't everybody's obviously going to defend right here, because you can actually make it so that this becomes a near impassable area. Um, Everywhere on this field you could effectively overload a defender because there was wide open carpet on either side of wherever you were trying to get to. And because it was the first game that I played, it's a little bit like the 2006 game Aim High. The same sort of height. You had to be shooting balls. They were kind of similar balls, and I really love Aim High, so I did go into it with the understanding that I'd probably like Infinite Recharge. Aim High was a good game. It was so early in the development cycle of FRC that the ever present, what game would it be interesting to replay, and they kind of, you see major elements from games come back, but like so many robots were unable to complete the basic objectives of Aim High, and the rules for what you could put on your robot back then were so different to what you could do now that, well, you could, with the size that your robot could be and the motors that you have now and the control systems that you have now, you definitely have robots that were shooting 40 of the poof balls consistently into the goal within like 6, 7 seconds. It just it wouldn't look like aim high. Aim high didn't look like that at all. The teams didn't have that capability. Robots weren't allowed to have that capability, but also teams, even if they, whatever. You can't directly compare games, but a fun thing to do if you're looking at most of the modern era of FRC, call back to the first presentation I did, where I did all the 3v3 games that we had up to the point last year. If you're watching most games from pre-brushless motors era, and you're trying to compare mechanisms or how teams played the game, play that YouTube video at 1.25 speed. Like 1.25, if you're watching like 2012 or 2013 or 2015, they look a lot more like modern robots. So then you can kind of get a sense of, oh, if we're doing a similar mechanism to this is kind of what that motion looked like. It's not motion magic, but the robots were just slower back then. They drove across the field slower. Their mechanisms were slower. So just crank that speed up. You'll get a better sense of what the game could look like. As I mentioned, these are the elements. These are the elements of the field. It's that rendezvous point in the middle under the shield generator. It looks like an absolutely gigantic and important field element, and it was, but it was also it had its little peccadillos. I mean, it was not easy to set up for the field volunteers, like hoofing that big truss around and making sure that you got it in the right place, and then when you didn't, readjusting and getting those tape lines right and putting those feet down where they're supposed to, and you're trying to scrape up the Velcro that's adhering to the carpet with those floppy pieces of plastic that they give you. There were elements that were annoying about this game. The tape lines were actually pretty hard because you didn't have a lot of frames. You didn't have a lot of fixed points to reference. I mean, the shield generator itself, like those 4 legs aren't square to like anything. So it's these sets of numbers that are strange. But even just the trench runs, like they don't stop at a certain point on the wall. So getting all of these right, difficult. This is a difficult game to set up a full field for a practice field for, but practice elements, this was actually a pretty good game for practice elements because outer and inner port, you need to make 2 holes. 2 holes is okay. It's not as easy as just like draw tape on the wall, which you can do some games where you're shooting into a high goal, but you couldn't do that in Crescendo anyway because you wanted the dynamics of how it would bounce around. It was true with this. You did need the 2 holes, but the shield generator, you could make their big structure and have it have I think it was the actual pivot that they used. You could do all that, or you could put a bar up that is just holding or is like it clamped to a high set of tables, and you could pull down on the bar and just not care about the balance and deal with that later. And you would never have to deal with it in most scenarios. So pluses and minuses in terms of what this was like to develop for in terms of the accoutrement that you would need to be ready. And there was a control panel, which I haven't mentioned up until this point. I talked about the table that could clothesline you in the trench run. On top of the table was a big spinny wheel, and you could spin that wheel. But we only saw 2 weeks of official competition with this, and then like a year and a half after it, we saw Texas Cup with the big spinny wheel, and we also saw Chessie Champs, which didn't do the big spinny wheel because they have to make their own FMS in Cheesy Arena, and they hated the idea of the spinny wheel. I'll defend it a little bit, but yeah, it was this whole stepwise thing. We'll get into points, but the spinny wheel only mattered if you were already super good at the game. So it was a common refrain during build season and the first couple of weeks of competition season that year that you're working on the control panel, your mechanism for the spinny wheel thing, that's got to be a lower priority. You have to make these other things work. You have to be able to hang. You have to be able to do something with the power cells. If you're out there spinning the spinny wheel, it will be in a match where we don't want you doing that because you are going to be in the way of us driving through the trench. And we need to keep putting power cells into the inner and outer ports. That's the major scoring element of this game. So teams that focused on it were mostly teams uh, that were trying to do the whole ranking point dance that year. Now, when you look at any game, you do have to come to the point values tables and their attached things. So next to the point values table in the manual is scoring criteria. So it tells you what things your robot has to be considered. Let's see, hanging. Yeah. If you were a hanging robot somewhere else, you have to reference a different part of the manual to know what it means to hang. There's a colloquial knowledge for some of these things, but not when it comes to like in-game stuff because they're going to define which things you can be touching every year. But for better and for worse, it means that you have to read the whole manual to actually get the entire picture of it. But what these do show a lot of they lead you to pretty obvious conclusions, and then you do have to do a little bit more legwork to get to the subtle parts of it. So there's the first part of the point values. We start with the initiation line, the leave of its day, the your robot drives in auto. I don't like it. I will never like it, but it's there. And you'll notice that it's worth 5 points in this game. That's because the other point values are huge and you can hold 5 power cells. If you score the 3 power cells that you start with in the inner port and auto, you get 18 points, like 6 per. And I said there are so many on the field. I looked this up and I might actually have these numbers wrong. I'm not 100%, but an individual robot doing what we would like doing this auto, you would do the podium notes auto. So these were kind of the different categories of driving around the field and picking up autonomous modes that year. So the beef auto, that's because somebody misheard me say thief auto. So there were 2 power cells that started under your control panel, under the table in the trench, but they were very close to where the opponents started. And they were sideways to each other. So there were 2 there, and then 3 in a line closer to the offensive robots. The robots for whom that was their protected zone. So we saw a lot of teams do this. 4911 Cyber Knights were already running it in their first 2 competitions, and when we saw Citrus Circuits 1678, this was the one that they ran in playoffs. They would start on the opposite side of left-right. They would start on the opposite side of the field from, okay, it's not a mirrored field, so I can actually do this. So your high goal was on the right side of the field away from your drivers. So wherever you were situated, blue or red, it's amazing. It's actually possible to do this. Blue or red, it would be on your right side. So they would set up their robot on the left side, so they wouldn't shoot before they started driving, because you could hold up to 5. So they would pick up those 2 that were under their opponent's table, their opponent's control panel, and then they'd go over and shoot all 5 of those. So that's the beef auto, which is the thief auto. If you did the trench and your opponent wasn't doing a beef auto, you could shoot the 3 that you started with, then pick up the up to 5 that were in there. But you would likely have something that would just go for the 3 that were actually there if your opponent was actually fighting you on this. Probably would have worked out if we kept playing this game, that you just weren't good at. Teams were going to develop auto modes that didn't even try to go for those 2. You would get into like 4D chess of, they think that we're going to take these, so they're going to run their short. Before we get to that, you could go down your trench run and pick up 5 more power cells. That's a lot more than the 3 that you start with. So if you were doing like an 8 power cell auto, that's a lot of points. If you picked up the 5 that started on the boundaries, and you could also have the preloaded notes, or the preloaded power cells in your robot. If they didn't go in your robot, they went on these boundaries, these parts of the rendezvous point, these berms. So you could do a couple of different things with just picking up a bunch of the power cells that were on there, and you could pick up the ones that were closer to your opponents if you knew their auto timing, all of these things. Like a single robot could score quite a few, like 50 points in auto, and you could get to, if you picked up all the power cells on your side of the field, if you weren't fighting under the trench or going to their boundary side, and you got them all in the outer or inner port, you could get these near triple digit autos. So it was a high scoring game. There was, so in the second table here, we get into the whole control panel, what it actually did in the game. So after you scored your first 9 power cells in any of, there was also a low goal. It didn't matter. Low goals, whatever. We're kind of past that. 2022 was really the big shift. I think, well, my friend Ty Tremblay's team, 2713, they initially built a low goal scorer in 2022 Rapid React. They shot in the lower part of the hub. By the end of the season, they had rebuilt it so that they could shoot in the upper hub. It just, these don't factor in nearly as much anymore. You don't need a place for a base bot to score, which was a base bot or like a robot that couldn't fling stuff. That seemed to be a directive for FRC games for a while, and it finally got to the point where teams aren't even bothering with that. So there was also a lower port, but everything mattered around the outer and inner port, the high goals. So if you scored 9 power cells, then once it became Teleop, you would be in stage 2. Or the way that they described which stage you were in was very confusing, but there were 3 stages that you needed to happen during the course of the game to get this ranking point. So if you scored 9 in auto, no, if you scored 9 overall. So the point I'm trying to make about this is once you've scored 9 power cells, you've reached the first threshold. So you're into the second threshold. Then you need to score 20 more on top of that and do rotation control, which is spinning the wheel 3 times. To get to the third part of it, past the second threshold, you need to score 20 on top of that, and then put the color wheel in different colors on it, the color wheel, in different wedges. You needed to put one specific wedge, one of the colors under the color sensor. So you had to score 9, then Teleop had to start, then you had to score 20, then you had to spin the wheel, then you had to score 20 and put the wheel in a certain position. So it was stepwise, and everything else that you can talk about it, you could like overflow these. Like if you scored more than 9 in auto, those extra ones don't count towards stage 2. And if you don't spin the wheel before you score more points after the first threshold, those don't count toward the third one. So there's this coordinated dance available to get this ranking point and to get these extra points for it, because you'd get 10 points for the rotation control and 20 points for the position control. But you could hold 5 power cells, and during the match, the power cells were worth 2 or 3 points in the high goal. So it didn't matter. It was such a small part of the overall score that this was mostly viewed as a qualifications only thing, which has a big stigma around it. There was a thing about the first stage, the capacity 9. So if you scored more power cells than that, but they were counted by the system after auto had ended, but before 5 seconds had elapsed, then they would count for auto points, but they would count for the capacity for stage 2. So it was a have your cake and eat it situation. So if you were really trying to maximize your ranking points, which you want to maximize your ranking points by winning the match, and then also by doing this whole rigmarole to get your control panel exactly where you want it, the shield generator energized, which if you're naming ranking points and you name one of them shield generator operational and the other one shield generator energized, nobody's going to call them that. It has to be like a word. I don't remember people actually calling they were the end game ranking point and the balls ranking point. Like you can't say this. Even the game announcers who try valiantly to use the actual terms, like that one's a bridge too far. But if you were really optimizing for this, you would want to hoard your auto power cells until just before auto ended, so that you could get that sweet like double counting thing. We definitely didn't get to that level of sophistication through the course of this game. I don't know if we ever would. You kind of don't. You're never really in a position where you can be that precious. Like you have to put the power cells into the ports. When does that happen? Auto, hopefully, because they're worth double. If you're scoring in the inner port, like this is unlike how the points worked for notes in Crescendo. You could score the same number of points for something autonomous later in Teleop by scoring an amplified note. You could never get to the point after autonomous in Infinite Recharge where you were scoring 6 points per power cell. So you wanted as many, like you needed to get all of them into the inner port if you could. It's just beaucoup points. So to do stage 2 and stage 3, you need to score 40 power cells. You can hold 5 at a time. 8 cycles. 8 cycles between 3 robots. But this is where we get into, so Infinite Recharge, no FRC game is made in a vacuum. There are development cycles for them. They take more than a year to make. So they can only react large scale to big trends in how teams are able to accomplish tasks. But there was a big sea change between 2020 Infinite Recharge and 2022 Rapid React. The abilities of robots leveled up in between those two. Infinite Recharge was the second year of brushless motors, so it's the second year that we saw Neos out there. It was the first year that we saw the CTRE motors, the Falcon 500s. And everybody who was on the brushless train stayed on it. Like there were teams in 2020 that were all Falcons that just they put both feet in and they jumped. However, you're supposed to do that metaphor. Like they were very happy with going full brushless. The power available, it really changed the game. The control available, the control of those motors was just not what teams were used to in terms of brushed motors. You didn't get this sort of instantaneous feedback with embedded encoders. Just robots were way better. There's a big difference between the best robots, or most robots, in Infinite Recharge and those in Rapid React. So this was still in the just getting into brushless era. So teams were just starting to discover how powerful robots could be. But Infinite Recharge was definitely still in the era of if you needed to do 8 full cycles of full capacity, all of your power cells actually go into the ports during Teleop, you were not counting on 3 robots to do that, 3 robots cycling. You were thinking 2 in good matches and 1 in qualification matches where you're not with teams that are at your level. So you looked at it and you said 8 cycles and do stuff with the color wheel, and those are 8 perfect cycles during Teleop. We can't miss any. We can't miss any pickups and we can't miss any deliveries. That one's hard. This is a game that's you can look at this game from the jump. Like it would play out slightly differently now. If this were the 2025 game, you would expect more from your partners, and you would be rewarded for expecting more from them. But this year's game, when it happened in 2020, it was the highest ranked teams at events are going to be pretty just barely above 3 ranking points. They're going to get that the end game ranking point, the operational ranking point. They're going to get that consistently. Um, the teams that have the match schedule where they can do that and they contribute to it. And if they get the other one, it's like pure gravy. Like we don't expect this to happen very often. It happened in the first 2 weeks of Infinite Recharge 2020. It happened once. Like it was not going to be common, even if we kept playing the game. So that one was really hard. To get the end game ranking point, you needed 65 points. You got 25 for each robot hanging, and you got 15 for it being level. So you didn't need anybody to come over and park. And in fact, in qualification matches, you definitely didn't want anybody near you when the two robots tried to hang. Because if they were touching, then the one wasn't hanging, or both of them were hanging. Whatever it was the same thing as 2018, where if you got the levitate power up, you didn't want that other robot in your home zone at all. There are always these things with just getting barely above the threshold for qualification matches. To get this ranking point, you only want two robots in there. You don't want all three of them doing the triple hang. It's worth more points, and so there might be a scenario where you'd want to do that, but you're reducing your chance of getting that ranking point. And you can't be missing out on ranking points, especially when you can't get the other one. You're never getting energized. So you can't. So everybody looked at the game and correctly said, we have to be able to hang. This is the only ranking point that we're going to be able to get. So if we don't contribute to it, we're just punting on the ability to be a captain. So that's the opposite sort of incentive that you'd have in playoffs. In playoffs, you want the most points. So you have to try for the triple hang. And if you're trying for control panel chicanery, if you're trying to get these position and rotation control, there are point bonuses associated with them, because in 2016 and 2017, the ranking points converted directly into bonus match points in playoff matches. Different values for them, but balancing those was difficult. And first, the FRC mostly moved away from that, in that they entirely moved away from it. So it says right below this table that there are no commensurate points for it. So you just get the same number of points as you would in qualification matches for doing position or rotation control, but you're not getting the ranking point. So playoff matches, even if you were scoring that many power cells, you probably weren't messing with the color wheel. You could if you had somebody fast to do it, because it was worth points, but you wouldn't be going out of your way to make sure that you're holding the next set of, like the next volley that you're going to shoot, so that your partner can spin the wheel. Like, if you get there, you get there. You're probably not optimizing around these 10 and 20 point bonuses. They just aren't worth that many. You could look at the point value table and come to conclusions about where you should be. There's so many more things that you have to look at. This is just a small section of the manual that goes over where the power cells start. This is important every single year. They have the game animation. You can't tell where the game pieces start. They have the manual with the top-down view, and you're already overloaded by the zone markings and the this and the that. And what does this zone even mean? So you have to look through this. Where do things start? Your robot can hold 5 power cells. It says that before this part of the manual, but not in auto. You don't start with 5. You start with a lower threshold than that. You can hold up to 3 that you get to preload. So then your robot's able to hold more than you can preload. These games are very different than the you can hold one game piece at a time games, because it has been the case in games where the auto mode point bonuses are so high that you actually make a robot that can't. There's a scenario where you would look at this and say, we're going to make a robot that can only hold 3 power cells. We care so much about the ones in auto that we're going to optimize for that. And then throughout Teleop, 3 is close to 5. That's closer to 5 than our system being inconsistent in auto, because we have these 2 empty spots. Instead of instead of adding this inconsistency, this difference in how our system works, you could say the system's going to work only one way. We're going to optimize for autonomous mode. Um, so the auto mode point bonuses are huge in Infinite Recharge, double points for scoring them in the ports. But 3 is not close to 5, and Teleop is very long. And there are a lot for you to pick up during autonomous mode. If you restricted your capacity to focus on the preload power cells, then you wouldn't be able to do some of the really high point value the high point value autonomous modes that you'd need to be able to do to be in these like great playoff alliances. So pay attention to what you can start with, where things start, what's going to happen in auto, what is your alliance going to do. So you could have I learned a new term this week. It was horrible, so I'm not going to use it. But what you can do in autonomous mode, and we see this in games with relatively high capacity. If you have a partner who is just fantastic, like their shooter's fantastic, dead bang on, like they're going to get it in the inner port, and your shooter's not great at that, but you can expel your balls, like you can reverse your intake. You can just set up right next to them. And they shoot the ones that they have, you push yours into their robot, and they shoot the ones that you started with. So they go from shooting 3 in the inner port to shooting 6 in the inner port. Big difference, because you're not going to get them in the inner port. Your power cells that you can start with, the easiest way to get them into the inner port might be putting them into somebody else's robot. A bomb. It was the thing in 2006 was you just had infinite. Your capacity was just limited by how big your robot was. So a robot could go collect balls for a long time, and then go over to their high-scoring partner and just reverse their intake and put them all into their partner's robot, and they were good at shooting. So they wouldn't have to go back and pick up balls. You could be picking up balls for them. And you can do that in auto. There are all of the places in the rendezvous point, the outside barriers of it, where you can pick up those extra balls or under the trench. Now, what is interesting, so it says point C, 5 power cells start on the rack. So there was a rack of 7 and 7 places for the human players to put power cells that their opponents had scored. It was the rack. You didn't have access to the rack during autonomous mode, but it only had 14 places on it. If your opponents scored a 15th power cell, your human players needed to return it to the field. There were no places on the rack for it. So you could get to these overflow states. If you scored enough, your opponents had to put balls directly onto the field. So you could get into these really, really, really short cycles. Now, 5 of those spaces were filled in autonomous when the match started. And there were 10 on the field and 9 that started in your robot, just on your part of the field. So you would be in overflow if you scored all the ones that were readily available to you. Well, that you had to pick up. So they couldn't actually return the balls during auto. But right after auto, they would be compelled to. The rules said that they had to be returned to the field. So you could start matches where you had just put all of your power cells into the ports that you were scoring in. And Teleop would start, and the human players have to put them out onto the field. It's a protected area that your opponents can pick up from. But in auto, right after auto mode, you might just be closer. If they have to put those balls out on the field, you might just pick them up. And so it might just be like this great first cycle for one of your robots. Like their human players have to put them on the field, and you're right there. So overflowing was always going to be a part of the game when one alliance scored more power cells than the other in terms of rate. So getting to that overflow really early was worth a lot because you could force them. Like you can't do a starvation tactic. You can't just your opponents score like a bunch of power cells and then you just hold on to them, and then there aren't any for anybody to pick up, so the score stays the same. FRC wanted to avoid that, so they had this not automatic. People had to actually do it, but this forced, it's like squeeze play in baseball. I don't actually know baseball terms. So the other thing that you always care about when you first look at the game in the manual is in the tournament section, how you are ranked during qualifications, and then how playoff tiebreakers work. And fortunately, this year, it's the same list. They're in the same order. It's possible for them not to be. I think some years they haven't been. And you always want to pay attention to that because you shouldn't do anything that makes your ability to win playoff matches worse, even if it's in service of ranking high. You have to find, you have to be able to find the point at which both of those things are optimized. And if one has to fall by the wayside, it is the ranking points because you can be ranked wherever you want. If you're in playoffs and you win every match, kind of doesn't matter where you were ranked. Vice versa doesn't actually work. So some games it's very different, but aside from if there were a couple of teams at an event that were getting every 3 ranking points, they were winning every match, and they were getting the hanging the end game ranking point, and they were really high performing teams, and they were each in each of their matches really actually trying to get that control panel control and get all that. Then you would see like the rankings actually it would matter for rankings whether you were able to do that. But in playoffs, that would get flattened out. Like if these 2 robots could both score power cells super, super well, and one of them was good at the color wheel, once you get to playoffs, the being good at the color wheel was probably not going to be the difference. So aside from that, the tie breaks and the ranking tie breaks being the same meant that you were focused on the same things. Like your first tiebreaker, your second sort being auto points. Again, you have like all of these points that you can score. Like you can the way that the game is described, there are all of these power cells available for you, and they're worth many, many points. So you already want to do auto well. But this reinforces that because if you do get into a scenario where your match scores are tied, you want to have had the better auto so you win. So I said it was reminiscent of Aim High. Let me take you back. This is Finals 2 from Einstein of 2006. You'll forgive the 240p. So you'll also have to forgive the fact that there's no full field camera. Right before the match started, you could see a view, a little bit of the field. But the robots started, so they had cameras up in the stands, but they couldn't use them for the full field view. Because if you look in the top corner here, there's a big blue sphere occluding part of the view. That is a ball filled with confetti. They popped those balloons filled with confetti right after one of the alliances won. That was their big celebration. And so just throughout Einstein, lots of people in the stands and the cameras couldn't see parts of the field because there were big balloons filled with confetti. We're not litigating this. So in Aim High, your robots started on the sides of the field, like the long sides. And your goals were on opposite sides. But you could cross any line that you wanted. So there was defense allowed in autonomous mode. Your robots could smash into each other and make it so that your opponents would lose their pre-programmed positions. A little bit of context of where we are in terms of Finals 2. In their previous matches, Red, their auto had been working, their Teleop had been working great, super fine, they're all happy. 217 has a turreted shooter with a weird hopper that goes up to a central polycord elevator into their shooter. 296 is one of the few teams that year that had top and bottom shooting wheels. They had a little turreted thing. They're from Quebec. Their shooter was working great. Blue Alliance was these were the powerhouse teams. If you were talking before championships, you'd be talking about these teams. 968 and 25 had paired up. 25 was absolutely dominant. Their accuracy was second to none. They had no K capacity. They couldn't pick up from the floor, but their accuracy was so good, and it was hard to push them because they just had They had really big, attractive wheels. It was a whole thing. It was hard to push them, but they had their big low mounted shooter on a turret, and the poof balls were in contact with the shooter wheel for so long that they went where they were telling them to go. And 968, they could go up on the ramp and shoot from there. They could shoot from close. They could shoot from far. It was just a big, big hopper, and then the floor would pull them up into the polycord elevator into a hooded shooter at the top. Fixed angle, but just really, really high scoring capacity here. Now, the Blue Alliance had made decisions in their previous Einstein matches based on the fact that the poof balls, the game objects, they were brand new for Einstein. And they were also of the batch that was of the softer balls. So everybody had their shooters tuned for how the balls were throughout all of championships up to that point, and it was the slightly harder batch of poof balls. So Blue Alliance said, our auto mode's going to miss. Like, our shooters aren't tuned for this. So they had been going and doing defense in auto mode. And in Finals 1, that didn't work. Like, their defensive autos missed Red's offensive autos, so Red still got the bunch of points from auto, and Blue got, like, none. So going into match 2, they chose a different tack. So they only sent their third partner over to defend, and they have, I'm sorry that they're focusing on the goal. They have 25 and 968 both shooting. So the conceit of auto was it was only 10 seconds, but each robot could start with 10 balls. And there were 3 points in the high goal. And whoever scored more in auto got a 10-point bonus. And the offense and defense, I explained this in like a presentation from a year ago. But it was very advantageous to win autonomous mode. So they're fighting for it. They're trying to get it. By this point, we've played 10 seconds of autonomous mode. Now they need to count the balls manually. So there's a big gap in between auto and teleop mode because this needs to be accurate in real time because it changes how the modes of the game go and also the bonus. So, but more importantly, the modes of the game. Like, you can't go back and fix who won auto later because the match will have played out differently because you have different capabilities during each section of the game, whether you're in offense or defense. So everybody's out there. The scorers are out there with their whiteboards, and they're holding them up for the scorekeeper at the middle of the table to see. And Red Alliance again has come out ahead in auto. So Blue Alliance they start on offense, and they have to pick up as many poof balls as they can and score them in this 40 seconds for this offensive period to be worth anything, because then they're going to go on defense and they can't score any points. When you're on defense mode, when the game is in defense mode for you, any balls that you score put into the high goal don't count for any points. So they have to rush over with however many they have and just put them in. And by the way, if you ever watch this match, which I highly recommend, I know it's hard to follow, but this is my favorite match to listen to ever. Bill Larkin, the game announcer, is just doing a fantastic job. He doesn't do it anymore, but it's so fun to listen to him. So 968, they had been able to shoot from the top of the ramp. So the defenders were waiting for them to come over to the ramp, but 968 just stopped short and shot from the middle of the floor, and they put a bunch in. This was back when a bunch was like 6 poof balls, but it was big. Like, Blue has in their first offensive period managed to take a lead, which was difficult to do in that game because you had to go get the balls because you'd already shot them all in auto. You had to go get the balls, get back over, and shoot them in the goal. So 195 managed to push 217 up to just the corner of its ramp and provided a backstop so that they could not come back down because they assumed that 217 couldn't shoot from this very acute angle into the high goal. So this was a cycling game. You did go back and forth. The balls that you scored would be given to your opponent's human players so that they could throw them onto the floor, throw them into their robots for them to score again. So it was a recycling game. And just there, we see, the score jumps just because it's real time and I'm talking about it. I'm not pausing when I should. But 217 actually was able to shoot into the goal from that corner. So they managed to retake the lead. It had been 43-51 during Blue's offensive, right after Blue's offensive mode. But then 296 and 217, with their combined scoring power, scored swung it back the other way, back up to a lead of 88-51. So now the third period happens, which is all offense. Both alliances are able to play offense. All the goals count. So now it's how quick can you cycle? How many balls do you want to put in before you go back to shoot? Because it has to be the right number. You have to get near your capacity because every time you go over to shoot, it's a whole sequence of events that has to happen. You don't want to do like one ball cycles because you can hold up to as many as your robot is physically capable of doing. But both of these, like Blue has just stormed back his 968 and 25 fired a volley. So it's a 1 point game. Both of these alliances are just going as quickly as they can back to their human players to get the balls. And now it's the final gambit where 25 is just trying to get this 1 second left in the match. These last couple balls could make the difference because the real-time score is showing like a 2 point difference. But there were also points for being on top of your ramp at the end of the match. Either alliance being on top of your ramp at the end of the match it was very confusing. But similar to Infinite Recharge, there was this sort of frenetic, we need to get across the field and we need to get back and we need to make each of these volleys count. In games where you're only holding one game piece at a time, a miss is very costly because you have to do an entire cycle. But it's also only one scoring opportunity that you've lost. If you miss a volley, then that's a larger commitment. So neither of these alliances were out there with the capacity to miss on volleys in this final match. But watch it sometime. It's so good. I like 2006. I know it's hard to follow. But 3 points per ball in this game. And in Infinite Recharge, it was 3 points per power cell in the inner port, 2 in the outer port during Teleop. And the end game for aim high, you would get 5 points for one robot on your ramp, 10 for 2, or 25 for 3 total. So lower scores overall. In qualification matches, the average alliance score was 50, and in playoff matches, it was 70. So even with the preload capacity in aim high was 30 total poof balls. Your alliance could start with 30 balls, and they were worth 3 points each in the high goal. So if we were playing aim high now, you'd be trying to do like 90-point autos. You'd be trying to get all 30 balls into that, and the match average for championship was 50. So it was a different time. But what did Infinite Recharge look like? So, oh, sorry. So what did Infinite Recharge look like? This is a match from Texas Cup. So this is Infinite Recharge 2 Electric Boogaloo, Infinite Recharge from 2021. There were some game and field changes, but largely the structure of the game was similar. If you're looking at how autos started, the power cells that were in the shield generator structure, instead of starting on the boundaries, the little berms, they started in the same thing that they used in Rapid React, just a little grommet that the ball would sit in, the little O-ring, so that it wouldn't roll around. But Infinite Recharge playoff matches averaged 130 points, and each robot was worth 25 points hanging in endgame. So you can watch the Red Alliance here. We've got the Blue Wranglers, which is the 148 second robot. They're doing the beef auto, and then they're also doing this the shield generator pickup auto. So Blue Alliance has also scored a bunch of points. Like auto ends and they're both in the 50s. A lot more power cells are getting scored than poof balls were getting scored in 2006. But you see that Red Alliance has one of their robots focusing on going to the very close protected zone, and their other robot, which is 3310, which you can't see at all from this camera angle, they're just going to the end of their trench run. So this is the blue trench run. They're in the red trench run over here. They're just going to the end of that and shooting from there. So their opponents, Barbecue 2714, if they want to defend Red Alliance, it's difficult because they're both shooting from protected zones, and those protected zones aren't the same. So uh, whatever the cycle synchronization is, uh, there's no perfect place for a defending robot to be. So they've moved over to the place where we saw a lot of defense being played in these in later or more mature matches of Infinite Recharge. Your opponents had one source place where they could pick up balls consistently, where they would get the power cells that you scored. So kind of defending near there was a little bit more effective. Blue Alliance is keeping it somewhat close because it's 15 points per volley, so you can make up some of large uh, these large deficits. But 3310, they're shooting 5 balls at a time, but shooting from that far from the end of their trench run protected zone. They're not aiming that much for the inner port. They care about the outer port. Just get the power cells in the high goal. So it's not so much about efficiency of points per power cell. It's just getting a lot in each volley into there. And then you see this is final 2 of Texas Cup. All 6 robots are trying to climb. Like you would want to at least match your opponents in end game. Whatever else teams were able to do, it was pretty clear in Infinite Recharge that you had to be able to hang. And one of the cool things about this dynamic shield generator, the structure, the coat hanger, as it will, was unless one of your robots was grossly underweight and was on the outside, if you had 3 robots hanging on the shield, if you had 3 robots hanging on the bar, you were probably level. It was very hard to concoct scenarios where that wouldn't happen. So it was cool. It turned into like a game of chicken because both of you are doing that. So how late can you get back to do that? How much longer can you spend with your wheels on the carpet shooting power cells? If you and your opponents are going to score the same number of points in endgame, then it's whoever takes less time to do it. And if we know that we're going to do it, they have to execute, and vice versa. So even though you both have the same capacity, it does still come down to execution. And you could have gotten into scenarios where teams took too long to do it, and they went from having this great end game of 90 points, 25 each and 15 per hang, to you could go down as far as 15. Like if all 3 of you were just parked. So you couldn't play chicken that hard. So what we saw with some of these robots, 148's robot had what the word that came out of Infinite Recharge was Spindexer. It was this washing machine tumbler. Everybody who had a Spindexer worked slightly differently, but it decoupled your holding area, your hopper of power cells, from your delivery to shooter mechanism. So the first one in wouldn't necessarily be the first one out. You would have this sort of it just for some robots it was just like spinning. It was spinning perpetually, and the power cells in there were just subjected to like a park ride, an amusement park ride. They would just be spinning in there, and then at a certain point you would tell it to push those power cells into the shooter, and a thing would happen, and then those power cells would just get plucked out one by one by one. It could be a scenario where you're spinning them opposite directions. Spindexers were this whole black magic thing. Like from the outside, you didn't understand what was happening. You saw a bunch of yellow turn into a blur, and it blurred for a while, and then something changed that you couldn't see, and then they were coming out of the robot. So visually appealing. But on a 2910 specific note, we were talking about Typhoon from our robot from the Crescendo season. We didn't make the whole turret thing based on the idea of a spindexer. Spindexers, from our understanding, held them kind of the opposite to how the opposite part of the robot to how we hold a note as it goes through ours. So when we were early in concept development for this robot, we asked, well, okay, but how are the notes going to get from the intake to the shooter? And one of our design kids said, I'm pretty sure I have it. Let me sketch it for you. This is what that design kid sketched. And everybody who looked at it said, this means nothing. I am so confused. What are any of these circles or lines? So what we got back after this feedback was this, the labeled drawing. This also didn't help. It can be very difficult to describe a complicated turret and like game piece feeding mechanism in 3 dimensions with scrawled notes and lines on a piece of paper. This is the concept described in this is actually the concept that we went with. But 1, it wasn't a spindexer, and 2, you should look at the CAD. This I don't think really does justice to what was actually on there. But looking at how 254 did Vortex this year, their robot for this year, that I think has a little bit more similarities to what I would consider a spindexer, where the note follows the same path or a very similar path regardless of situation, where the way that our robot Typhoon does it is that note will take a very different path depending on a variety of factors. See, it's the same thing. It's actually in the same orientation, this picture of our V1 of the shooter and this picture. If you are able, go right ahead and try to match them up. I absolutely love this picture. It was one of my favorite moments of the season. So we watched an infinite recharge match with like a couple of with several very high level robots, 624 on the Blue Alliance, Kryptonite and Black Hawk, and Roblue Wranglers on the red, like very high scoring machines. That was from a match that was played a year and a half after this game came out. However much development teams were actually doing on their robots aside, that was kind of the late stages possible in Infinite Recharge. This is a qualification match from an in-season tournament during the year 2020, and this match features one of the number 1 seeds from this event. I think this is the one that I picked out. But this is like a bog standard like regulation qualification match for a week 1 or week 2 event for this season. So none of the power cells on the boundaries have been picked up. I think only one of the power cells that started in the trenches got picked up during auto. So early play in most games and in Infinite Recharge as well saw those 3 preloaded power cells that you started with were like a huge portion of your scoring. Like it's half the score that the Texas Cup teams were getting. So we see one of the blue robots. Ugh, the numbers are just so small I can't actually. But they're going to a point at around the shield generator leg to shoot from. So they've got a pretty good range on that shooter, and this worked for quite a few teams. Were able to do these really long range shots. Different reports on how consistent that was. Some teams found that it depended on how long they shot that particular batch of power cells. Like they would degrade over time, but other teams reported that they could consistently do it even after putting the power cells through their paces in their shop. Like they were getting the same results after a lot of testing that they were early testing. But this is the sort of qualification match that you would see. Like pretty much one robot on each side scoring well going into the outer port and maybe get lucky and get a couple in the inner port. Um, we see some use of the logo by both alliances. The Every bot that year kind of looked like this red robot, so a little a contained hopper on the outboard collector arm, and then able to go from picking up from the floor to delivering to the logo with a straightforward pivot. Um, and as qualification match, regardless of the capabilities of all 6 robots, you'd definitely only be trying to have a couple robots getting on the hanging bar at the end of the match. But quite a bit lower scoring, just the field available qualification matches. You're not going to see quite the same level of acumen as you are in playoff matches, but also early season compared to late and even post season. Um, when you're thinking about how games are going to play out, you have to consider that you got to play like early week qualification matches. And if you want to, you have to look at how's this going to play out on Einstein, on division finals, on like district championship playoffs. What when you get to really high performing alliances on both sides, what's this game going to look like compared to a qualification match where um, we have to put in the bulk of the point scoring. So like it's the same game. It's largely the same game that they were playing in Texas Cup, but the dynamics shift quite a bit. So of the games to have lost, I think it was a shame that it was infinite recharge, because I think that it wasn't, I don't think we saw an equivalent maturity of the game in week 2 that we did in other games in their week 2. Uh, there was a really, really, really high ceiling on what this game could have become. Once you got into higher leverage moments, it would be a legitimate question of how much is it going to matter to us, these cycles of 5 power cells that we're doing, how many of them go in the inner port? Like, is that going to be the difference on Einstein if you're getting more inner port shots than your opponent, because your power cells cycle to them and theirs to yours. So if you're trading 2 points for 3, you have to outrate them by a huge margin. If you want to talk about how this is relevant to the NBA, yes, there are some parallels. There are some point value parallels there. It's referred to on NBA Twitter as the math problem. Like there are very high performing teams in the NBA that in certain matchups, they just come up against the math problem. They are very, very good at scoring 2-point field goals. But if the opponent gets enough 3-point field goal attempts, then the variance of those shots is enough that if they're shooting hot, it kind of doesn't matter that you're scoring at a higher rate on your 2-point shots if they're just scoring half again as many points for the shots that they are taking. You have to make a lot more shots than they do to make up that difference. So it definitely would have gotten to that point where that would make a huge difference in auto. You would have auto modes that were optimized for, I'm not picking up 5 power cells over the course of this, I'm picking up 3. But if all 3 of those go in the inner port, then that's worth more to me than 5 in the outer port, because I don't care about getting to those threshold capacities anymore. I just care about points. So those sorts of trade-offs it would have been interesting to see the development of systems to take advantage of those trade-offs. Where you could score from, so that those scoring locations that I was highlighting that the Texas Cup Alliance was running with 148 and 3310. 148 was shooting from very, very, very close, right under the goal. So their shots had to bounce off the top, like the ceiling of that goal, which reduced the chance of those going into the inner port quite significantly. Is their internet good? Okay. So the trade-off is you're able to score these shots. Your opponents aren't able to directly defend you, but your chance of getting those 3-point shots is so low that as to be insignificant. And so if you shoot a similar thing would kind of happen if you were shooting from far enough away. Yeah, you could make them in the outer port, and you could make them in the inner port. But the farther away you are, just the chance of accuracy of precision at that point, you just no system is able to deliver that level at a certain range. And so even if you're aiming for if you're aiming for a strategy, your alliance's focus is on inner port shots. Even as much as you want to do that, some of them just aren't going to go in the inner port. It could be the power cells hitting each other within the outer port. It could just be that one wasn't really as much of a sphere as the other ones. So these sorts of things work out to. I like a little bit of variance in games. You don't want wild swings of variance where one set of decisions just leads you down a path of never being able to win. But within high performing alliances, you shouldn't. I don't like seeing games where alliances score the same number of points every playoff match. There should be a little bit of variance, just because at really high levels, I think that outcomes shouldn't be predetermined. That was definitely a failing of 2017 Steamworks. You had these really big jumps in scoring. You had to score. You got a certain number of game pieces, and then only after you got to the total number that you needed for each scoring action, then you would get the points for it. So the difference of one game piece could be a huge number of points, and so that doesn't work out to have games with a nice, like a little amount of variance to allow for randomness. That one is just, you're just going to be in matchups where you can't win. Like your opponents have the capability and you don't, and you can never bridge that gap. And yeah, predetermined stuff. 2011 Einstein was very much like that. As long as teams execute, caveats aside, the way that 2011 Einstein worked out was one alliance had the faster mini bots. There's nothing you can do when you're on Einstein to change that. And the way that point values worked in that game, you couldn't overcome them by any other action. So, yeah, predetermining stuff is pretty. It makes for uninteresting matches. I think I was saying the end game timing chicken. I think that would have been quite interesting because, yeah, coordinating 3 robots is difficult, but you would have been making your hang so it would happen in under 5 seconds. So how close to that bare edge can all 3 of you get? Because if you're all swinging in there with under 10 seconds left, and you put your hooks up and you pull, and you all get up, then that's great. You can get to coordinated actions where you aren't adding everybody's times together, or even doing a multiplier, just sort of a penalty for having to coordinate. So it could have gotten to really, really, really very high scores there, and a lot of high leverage. Both alliances, all 6 robots are swinging into the rendezvous point with like 8 seconds left. I have no idea what's going to happen. Each of them has shown that they are able to get 90 points coming in with this much time left. But are they going to do it? That would have been a lot of fun. It would have been a supercharged version of the charged up endgame, where it was, you'd all try to balance right at the end, like as late as you could. But the big difference there is charged up endgame asked you to be able to drive your robot. And Infinite Recharges endgame asked you to have a mechanism to do something. I think that this is a big difference. What we saw at Chessy Champs in 2021 was a lot of instances in qualifications and then a little bit in playoffs of getting to that overflow point so that a robot could stay in their offensive zone. They wouldn't have to cycle back to get game pieces that their opponents scored. Their alliance would be scoring so many that their opponent's rack was always full, even if the robots were coming over to pick up game pieces to score themselves. So their human players would be forced against their better judgment. Strategically, it would be you would not do this. You would not be just putting game pieces onto the floor, but they had to. The game dictated that they had to return these to the field. So you could get to the point where even both alliances were overflowing. So then you had one robot coming in and sniping, like picking up power cells from their opponent's source and scoring them so quickly that their opponents couldn't get them out of that cycle consistently. It would have been quite interesting to see what sort of alliances would have been formed. Like 3 full field cyclers, one robot shooting from behind the control panel, like far shots, just so that they have a very, very, very short cycle. One robot going all the way over to their protected triangle under the goal, and then also trying to pick up the ones that miss, and their opponents are able. Similar to Crescendo, I think that you would have had more than one viable alliance makeup to win, which is big plus. I like games where you could make different decisions and still win. You could have a different alliance makeup and put out like a very different match, but still a very high performing match. Charged Up didn't really have that. By the end, there were 2 viable strategies: 3 robots cycling and scoring on their respective grids or positions where they wouldn't be in each other's way, or 2 robots doing that and 1 robot throwing a bunch of cubes over the charge station very quickly, so there were just more cubes in there to fill up the low nodes by the end of the match. Those are both. There were differences there, and you could optimize a little bit, but largely those are the same. I think that there would have been more opportunity for different alliance makeups in Infinite Recharge to perform and to really force their opponents to react to them, because you would have to have a different plan for each of those. And with beef autos and the ability to go pretty far across the field, you couldn't cross your alliance zone line, so like the line where you started, but your opponent's version of that. But you could drive across about 80% of the length of the field, so you could get some pretty far afield autos. You could go nuts out there. You could go down your opponent's entire trench. If they weren't going to pick those up, you could, and you could kind of play chicken in auto, because as long as they don't touch you, you're allowed to be in there. So you could have gone out even farther than just the 2 that are sitting under the control panel, and you could have started pushing it. And if you started pushing it, then they would have had to react to that. Have it possibly. It's very hard to actually have these quick auto development sessions. It's not the easiest to be able to add on stuff. It's easier now. It wasn't as easy in 2020. Path Planner certainly wasn't as mature as it is, and I don't even know if it existed. But you probably wouldn't have gotten to these really sophisticated like auto chess battles in that way that we saw a little bit along the center line in Crescendo. But you would have been able to see this alliance has a robot that comes over and actually picks up from our boundaries, like our side of the shield generator. We should be running a different auto mode so that they're less incentivized to do that. There were so many different places for you to pick up and so many power cells that I think it would have taken a lot for it to really settle into these are the auto modes that you're doing. I think there would have been more variance there. That could have been really cool. Every game has stuff that doesn't work super well. The color wheel, like, to do all of that to energize the shield generator, to go through all 3 stages, your alliance had to score 49 power cells over the course of the match. And yes, you start with this, and there are these that you can pick up, and you can hold 5 at a time. That's a lot. That is just a lot of things to do. And then you have to do other stuff on top of that requires an entirely separate mechanism. That's a really tall order. And teams weren't up to it. partially because it's hard to incentivize things properly in games. I generally try not to judge games entirely, or I don't judge games too harshly by uh, the point value for this was wrong. Like overall, the fact that the trap was worth the same number of points as a single amplified note in Crescendo, I think that that's not great, but I forgive it a little bit because it's super hard to get those numbers right. And if you get it wrong, if you get it wrong in a disastrous way, it shifts the entire balance of the game. Steamworks 2017 is that distilled into I don't even know chemistry terms. Every point value in that game was wrong, and so it was just this nightmare. Like what was Steamworks supposed to look like? If you change all of the point values, the game plays out entirely different. Okay, that's facile. You can say that about anything, but if you change one of the point values for any of the actions that happened during Steamworks, the game plays out entirely differently because teams build different robots. And some of them would have been kind of straightforward. Like maybe hanging shouldn't have been worth 50 points if you could just spin Velcro onto a Velcro rope. It got to the point, like the problem with how that one worked in what it demanded of teams was it was not a bonus to be able to hanging wasn't or going up and touching the touchpad thing, the end game for that game. It had nothing to do with the ranking points, but you had to do it because it wasn't something that was a bonus. It wasn't. It's great if we can get these 50 points. It's we will be missing out on these 50 points if you're not able to do it. And that comes down to how straightforward it is to be able to do something. And um, when you have that many points associated with it, you definitely have to be able to get up your rope in 2017. Otherwise, you are just not pickable. Like you will not fit into any alliance. So you do see that in Infinite Recharge. It would have been pretty similar with hanging. Um, but it wasn't worth quite so many points. So there were matches where you could eschew hanging if it worked out that it would disrupt your partners too much, or the the dynamics of the match led to you just getting a lot of points from power cells at the end. That was a defensible choice. You could get to a reasonable point value versus risk assessment on that. With a game like Steamworks, you couldn't. There was no situation where it was correct to not hang, to not get up your rope. These turn into when it's requirements, games get less interesting because then every match has to look the same. It was a problem with Charged Up. By championships, it was obvious. Well, it had been noted that every place that you could score would get scored by not every alliance, but you had to have some way to differentiate these teams. And as you got into some of the really some of the off seasons that had really good teams in it, the most playoff matches came down to supercharged nodes. Like it did matter how many extra you could do on top of that. But that means that you have to get the auto exact like not the all the auto pieces, but you have to get the auto engage in Charged Up, and you have to get the end game. You have to. There's no way to win matches if you don't. That's not a great dynamic. Like it would be cool in Infinite Recharge if you had matches where you could make the choice. We aren't going to send more than one team to do the generator switch, to do the end game. Our two power cell robots scoring is so good and their end game isn't quite so good that we think that we can almost make up these points and the risk is way too high. So you could have scenarios where you could make alliances where it would be the correct decision to not do part of the game. Those are cool. You at the absolute highest levels, you probably don't get to that, but you might have with the control wheel, with the color wheel, the control panel. Um, you would definitely envision a scenario in Infinite Recharge if it were played out, where the winning alliance for championships doesn't do the color wheel because it's 30 points and you can't get those points anywhere else. But game pieces recycle, so you can kind of get those points somewhere else. It games where there are little optimizations and tweaks that you can do, those get big points in my estimation of games, worthless as it is. Um, Along with the weird stuff, I did talk about the the rendezvous point, all of its wheel destroying prowess. Another thing that it had was it's the middle of the field, and your both alliances are doing endgame. So all of the rules that you would expect to apply to endgame were in there. If you touched an opponent that was hanging, they would just get the hanging points and the level and all of that. But you were right next to each other, so it didn't take a whole lot for your swinging. Your hook has to go up a certain way, and you have to drive a certain distance past it to actually engage the thing. You would see teams meeting in the middle pretty often in those first couple of weeks of infinite recharge. So there, that was pretty high. Like it was high leverage. It was the end game, and there were a lot of points that you could get for a violation, or your opponents could get for a violation that you made, and you were right next to each other. They happened a little too often. It was kind of like the stage protection, but this was like you'd both be trying to climb, and the hook, you pulled down your hook and it wasn't engaged, so you put it back up and you drive forward a little bit, but they've already gone up, so you drive into their area and you hit them as you're trying to climb. They were very close to each other, like very close to each other. That was an interesting thing, and some teams probably did make the conscious choice. Our hook can't be set up at an angle, so we have to drive past. We have to be able, like, either the hook has to go on and positively engage, or it has to be straight up and down, so that we can never have this scenario that was pretty common happen. Um, and I talked a lot about how I thought it was interesting. Your opponents have to return stuff. It's always weird if you're forced to do that. If you are incentivized to do something that would be strategically like drummed out, like you would, the same thing as human players this year learned not to just immediately fill their source with a note if their opponent had the ability to come over and steal it. Like you wouldn't do this, so the game forces you to do it. So the fouls for it were very weird, and you would also have these qualification matches where if one alliance is just they're going into overflow, like the opponent human players have to put game pieces back every time that they come in. When you're scouting that match, you're looking at those robots and you're going, they scored like 35 power cells each. That's a really high number. That's superb. They're not going to be able to do that in a playoff match. How effective is your scouting of this going to be if it's like this scenario isn't going to happen? So you could have these really unbalanced, a much worse version of was this team being passed to this year when you were like counting how many game pieces they scored. It could get to some really snowball qualification matches. I defended the stuff on the previous slide. The stuff I won't. This does hit a little bit harder after another game with a foam game piece, but this was the power cells were the dodgeball balls. They were 5-inch balls, but they were the same inner structure and outer rhino skin covering as the 2016 game piece, the boulders from Stronghold. And a lot of teams that year intentionally went with a catapult. One, because with one game piece, like catapults are actually, they're quite good at a lot of the things that you want, but with more game pieces, you can't cycle into a catapult. That's not how the mechanism works. So the benefit of a catapult in a lot of ways is as the game pieces degrade, your accuracy doesn't, not nearly as much as with a wheeled shooter. But so you can't have that in infinite recharge because you definitely hold more than one game piece at a time in the course of normal gameplay. And we did foam balls in 2006, 2012, 2016, and then again in 2020. And again in 2024. They weren't balls, they were toroids, but The thing is, to play FRC well, you do impact the game piece in a couple of violent ways, and in shooting games especially. And it's foam. The problem I have with bringing it back is that to effectively play the game, you have to spin stuff fast at it to pick it up and to get rid of it. Even if you mandated that you couldn't do shoot, there are all these things. 2006, there was a velocity limit on how fast you could shoot. That was not very effective. The ball still got torn up. Whatever you do, the problems with foam aren't going away. So I don't know how much we are actually learning about game pieces when foam breaks the same way, and we are always going to break it that way. I'm kind of over it. What they changed, one of the biggest things that they changed for infinite recharge, well, not infinite recharge at home was its own set of challenges, but the game that they released for 2021 that was played at off seasons, and I mean, they did not have very high hopes that there would be an actual season. They were being realistic. It was very good that they didn't release a new game, but they changed the those thresholds for the number of game pieces that you needed to get for each of those stages for the whole color wheel thing, just lower. They were much lower. You had to score way fewer game pieces to get to each of the things. It would have been possible to get these ranking points, all of this stuff. Like, if you're able to tweak thresholds and numbers, as shown with the more nimble philosophy that they had in the Crescendo season, where they talked about it early in the manual, but then they did tweak the threshold for harmony, like each time that they had an opportunity to do it. It was not codified in the manual for 2020, and so given the big opportunity of, oh, it's a new season, it's 2021, they did tweak those and make them closer to what would be reasonable. So the rendezvous point had the 4 outside berms, the boundaries, and then 2 going down the middle and 2 breaking those up in perpendicular. There were so many of them. Like, that's why you would shred your wheels, just because you kept going over all of these things. And like, this was when the Mark III came out for Swerve Drive Specialties, a metal wheel, a wheel with tread on it, a billet wheel instead of the plastic wheels, because the plastic wheels got shredded when 2910 would go into the corral in 2019 where they had the cargos. Like, that would blow up the wheels. So presciently, Patrick said, well, we can't have wheels blowing up, and so billet wheels, and so that was the only way that they could actually handle that rendezvous point. If they were running around on plastic wheels, they wouldn't have lasted matches. They would have just gotten stuck with like no wheels left halfway through the match, just in the middle of the rendezvous point. Some teams went full pneumatic wheels, and they didn't do the under the trench thing being short. There are advantages to being tall. You have a greater chance of your inner port shots. It's harder to defend you. All of these, like, shooting's better from up there. You don't have to squish everything down. So if you want to go through the rendezvous point, bounce over at 2016 style. You can go over anything, and you could get to that point, but you would have to make these pretty major design choices to be able to go over them. So in 2021, they just took out a lot of those pieces of steel just out of there. There were like half as many or fewer than that. Good decision. We've seen more things about the cable guards. Like, there wasn't a cable guard this year because there were no electronics on the stage this year, but the bump from 2023, there's a balance that they're trying to find with obstacles on the field. And yes, big change from 2020 to 2022 is proliferation of cut swerve and all of that. And it's better for flat fields and all of this, but they can go over a lot of these bumps. But those berms, I mean, there were berms in 2016. That's why I called them that. The powder coated steel tube, no matter what wheel you're using, it's pretty rough on them, up to pneumatic wheels. But rough on pneumatic wheels, it might be rougher, but it kind of doesn't matter. That's the whole point. But uh, still, FRC is still trying to find that balance. And 2020, yeah, way too many. It made endgame really hard. It made going through it in the middle of the match really hard in not a positive way. Um, Another thing, so 2024 was really good about this from a referee's perspective. Crescendo, if either robot had its bumpers inside any of the protected zone and opposing alliances hit, then whoever's protected zone it was got awarded the points. 2020 didn't have this. Depending on which zone it was, it mattered which robot was in it for each of these interactions. This is very hard to keep straight. It makes referees' job a lot harder, and you don't want you want to watch matches. You want matches to go the way that they should and to be called effectively. Referees shouldn't be the story, and if it's really hard to keep everything straight, to oh well, okay, red was in blue, but it's this zone, so that's not a foul. But over there, blue was in red, and it's the other zone, so it is a foul. Those sort of inconsistencies. It's better if it's blanket. Uh, it's better if it's consistent, and balancing that with making sure that you don't just have a gigantic foul that's two tech fouls and also a ranking point for something that is kind of hard to avoid. On balance, I do think I have to take that. I do prefer that the zones be consistent. It's hard to get everything right, but um, having it be that when this happens, this is the violation for that. The fewer of those that there are, the more correctly refereed matches will be. So, infinite recharge, the good, the weird, the ugly. Oh, well, for those of you who were tuning in live, thanks to you for checking your notifications and popping in for this pop-up presentation. The first of our 2024 series. I've got plans for a couple, and I have more weeks and times available than I have plans. So if you have suggestions, you can pass them along. We check our Instagram. I don't, but somebody checks it, and then it gets. We check our Instagram. There are other ways to contact us. If you have questions about infinite recharge, you can also direct those in addition to suggestions or questions about any topics. But I would be happy to go over stuff because it's such a good game. I mean, yes, it was just aim high played again, but aim high was so good. Oh, shooting more than one game piece at a time. It's so much more fun. Infinite recharge was great. You could shoot it from a bunch of different places. Yeah, auto was fantastic, and I don't think that it was ridiculous for teams to put color wheel spinning mechanisms on their robot. When that ranking point is so rare, you want to be able to take advantage of the very few opportunities that you have for it. But yeah, not at the cost of doing anything else. That's why priority lists matter. But that's looking through it, like you would come to the same conclusion about the color wheel or the color wheel mechanism as you would for the trap mechanism. So be honest with yourself. Like you made the trap mechanism just so you would get ranking points. So you would make the color wheel mechanism. So think about that in next year's game when you look at the points that you get in qualification matches and the criteria for ranking points and the points you get in playoff matches. Because you're going to have to make choices like that. So recognize what does actually go into those. But it's late. I know it's West Coast. East Coasters, if you watch this as a video on demand, then it really doesn't matter what time it was. But I think Infinite Recharge was very interesting. Some other games are about as interesting, but I think that this one was a big shift. The first full year of two brushless motors and a game that had so much potential to it that wasn't realized. I mean, I can make this game anything that I want it to be, and So I kind of have, but yeah, I would have really liked to see this play out. If we had to lose a game, it could have been Destination Deep Space. All right, that's it.